per request, let's talk about ABG interpretation. I already have a video that talks about the 4 acid-base imbalances, their most common underlying etiologies, and their most common clinical manifestations. But in this video, I just want to help you learn how to quickly and easily interpret an ABG. And I've got it broken down into 6 easy steps. If you follow these steps, you will never miss another ABG question. All right, so step 1, we're going to look at our pH. Our pH normally ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. A high pH means that your patient is leaning towards a state of alkalosis. A low pH means that your patient is leaning towards acidosis. So if you just simply look at your pH, you can already determine if it's an alkalosis or an acidosis. Next, let's look at the PaCO2. This is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The normal range is 35 to 45. Easy to remember, right? Because our pH ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. So if CO2 is high, we're leaning towards acidosis. If CO2 is low, we're leaning towards alkalosis. Now, think. Drill this into your head. CO2 equals acid equals respiratory. CO2, acid, respiratory. CO2 is held in or eliminated by the lungs, okay? So when a patient is hypoventilating, they are holding in CO2. When a patient is hyperventilating, they are blowing CO2 off. So CO2 equals acid equals respiratory. And so if you think about that, it makes sense because CO2 is acidic, and when it's high, look, we're in a state of acidosis. When it's low, we're in a state of alkalosis. Step number 4, let's look at the bicarb. Normally, bicarb ranges anywhere from around 22 to 26, but always, again, go by what your instructor gives you as far as the levels. So if bicarb is high, this is alkalosis. When bicarb is low, we're leaning towards acidosis. Next, I want you to think again. Think bicarb equals base equals metabolic. So bicarb is either retained or excreted by the kidneys. So bicarb, base, metabolic. So that makes sense, right? That if bicarb is high, we're leaning towards alkalosis because it is a base. If bicarb is low, we're leaning towards acidosis. All right. Finally, we're ready to interpret. So simply by looking at the pH, we can determine acidosis versus alkalosis. All right. Next, we're going to compare our PaCO2 versus our bicarb. So if it is our PaCO2 that's more out of its normal range, then it's going to be a respiratory issue. If it's our bicarb that's mostly out of its normal range, it's going to be a metabolic issue. So always, step number 1, you're going to look at your pH and determine right off the bat if it's acidosis or alkalosis. Then we're going to make sure that we have learned the normal levels of CO2 and bicarb, and we're going to look at those 2 things on the ABG and compare them. If CO2 is more out of its normal range, then the imbalance is a respiratory imbalance. If bicarb is more out of its normal range, then the imbalance is a metabolic imbalance. Okay, so what if you're thrown a curveball like this? This is an ABG in which the pH is normal. The CO2 and bicarb, however, are not. So we're going to call this a fully compensated ABG. But it's a fully compensated what? Well, we're still going to go through our steps, step by step, just keeping in mind that at the very end, we're going to label it as fully compensated. So first, we're still going to look at that pH. Is it high or low? Well, it's leaning towards the lower end, so we're going to call it an acidosis. Next, we're going to look at the CO2. Is it high or low? Well, it's very high. It's 50. So again, leaning towards an acidosis. Now we're going to think. CO2, acid, respiratory. So the CO2 is held in or eliminated by the lungs. So clearly something is going on here where the patient is holding in CO2. Now we're going to look at the bicarb. Is it out of its normal range? Yes, but not really. So we're going to think again, bicarb equals base equals metabolic. Then we're going to be ready to interpret, right? So we've looked at the pH. We've already determined that it's acidosis. Now we're going to compare our CO2 versus our bicarb. Which one is more out of its normal range? And it's definitely the CO2, because the CO2 is 50, but the bicarb is 27, so the bicarb is just barely out of its normal range. So this is an example of a fully compensated respiratory acidosis. Okay, it's fully compensated, meaning that the body has compensated for the imbalance enough to get that pH back within normal limits. So now that we've looked at a fully compensated ABG, how do we get there? Methods of compensation. So my students get tripped up on this a lot, but it's really easy if you can kind of learn in your mind what's going on with the body, what needs to be done with CO2, what needs to be done with bicarb. So always remember that if it's a respiratory imbalance, the kidneys are going to have to compensate. If it's a metabolic imbalance, the lungs are going to have to compensate. Okay, because the system that's affected cannot compensate for its own imbalance, right? So if it is a respiratory issue, the kidneys are going to have to do something with bicarb or hydrogen. So let's say, for example, we have a respiratory acidosis. So what would the kidneys do to correct a respiratory acidosis? Well, they would retain bicarb and excrete hydrogen, because hydrogen is acidic. Okay, so let's say we have a metabolic alkalosis. What would the lungs do to help compensate for that alkalotic state? Well, we need to hold in more CO2 to help balance things out, right? So the patient would hypoventilate to hold in CO2 to compensate for that alkalotic state. So just always remember that whatever your imbalance is, the opposite system is going to have to compensate. And so the opposite system is going to have to do something with what they're in charge of, okay? The lungs being in charge of CO2, the kidneys being in charge of bicarb, okay? So I hope this video has helped you guys. Make sure you check out the acid-base imbalance video if you haven't already, and happy studying.